Welcome to Hidden Chapters. No one pulled a trigger. Something still ended. Let's begin. The last transmission wasn't a call for help. It was a status update that shouldn't have existed. We were set on overwatch above a narrow valley, the kind of terrain that makes distance feel honest until the wind shifts and reminds you sound travels wherever it wants. The village below looked ordinary from elevation: stone roofs, a thin road, smoke that could have been cooking fires or nothing at all. The briefing called it a transit point. A place people moved through when they didn't want to be seen. A special allied battalion had the task: move in, clear, confirm, extract. Our job was simpler on paper: hold position, keep eyes on the perimeter, and let the battalion do what it was built to do. We watched them enter in a clean sequence, disciplined spacing, no noise that didn't serve a purpose. Their comms were calm. Short check-ins. Routine confirmations. The kind of radio traffic that tells you everyone believes the plan is still in control. Then it stopped. Not gradually. Not like a bad connection. Not like someone ducking behind terrain. Everything went dark at once. No distress call. No panic. No final words. Just silence. I remember staring at my handset like it owed me an explanation. We tried every channel, every relay, every backup frequency we had. Nothing. The battalion had been talking 1 second, and the next it was as if they had never existed. Command's first response was predictable: hold position. Don't move. Don't compromise the perimeter. Wait for confirmation. Wait for re-established comms. Waiting is easy when you believe silence is temporary. But this silence had shape. It had timing. And the worst part was what didn't happen. No explosion. No smoke column. No movement spilling out of the village. No frantic vehicles racing the road. If something had gone wrong, the mountain should have shown us some proof. Instead, the village looked unchanged. Almost calm. Too calm. I kept optics on the main street, scanning corners, doorways, rooftops. Nothing. No fighters. No fleeing civilians. No signs of an extraction either. The battalion hadn't come back out. They hadn't even shifted positions in a way we could catch from above. My team leader repeated the order: hold. My mouth said, copy. My body didn't believe it. Because I'd seen real chaos before, and it leaves debris behind. This was different. This was absence engineered to look like nothing happened. I told myself I was imagining patterns because I wanted an answer. Then another transmission broke through the static, faint, distorted, not routed through any channel we recognized. A fragment of a voice. 2 words. A number. Then silence again. A minute later, a data burst hit our system like it had been shoved through a crack in the world. Partial. Unverified. A list of civilians marked as moved. Hostages, the note implied, taken during the clearance, destination unknown. I scanned it once without breathing. Then I scanned it again. And my vision tightened on one entry that turned everything inside me cold. My wife's name. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this operation. She was back home, far from mountains and radios and coded lists. The system had our lives separated on purpose. And yet there it was, her name, typed like a simple fact. In that moment, the battalion's silence stopped being a mystery on a map. It became personal. And I understood the real choice in front of me wasn't about orders or protocol. It was about whether I could stand still. While the mountain kept a secret that now had my wife's name on it. I read the name again. Then a third time. I told myself lists can be wrong. That fragment stitched together under pressure carry errors. That someone else's wife might share the same first and last name. The mind reaches for small comforts when the alternative is too sharp to hold. But the details matched. Age. Nationality. A note in the margin that only someone inside the system would include. I closed the file and didn't look at it again. Staring wouldn't change what it meant. It would only make standing still harder. Command came back on the net with more confidence than information. They acknowledged the comms loss. They said a recovery element was being assembled. They told us to hold position and maintain overwatch until further instructions. Hold position. The phrase landed differently now. Holding made sense when the mission was abstract, when it belonged to maps and tasking orders. It made less sense when silence carried names. When the distance between overwatch and inside the village was measured in minutes, not kilometers. I asked for clarification. Not about the battalion. About the civilians. The answer came back carefully shaped. Unconfirmed reports. Local interference. No verified hostage-taking. The data burst we'd received wasn't in their system. It didn't exist as far as they were concerned. That was the moment I understood something had slipped outside the structure. If the list wasn't in their system, then whoever sent it hadn't wanted it to be. They wanted us to see it. Specifically me. Because otherwise, it would have gone to command, to intelligence, to people who process tragedy at a distance. Instead, it came to the ridge. I looked down at the village again. From elevation, it still looked harmless. Stone and shadow. A place that could swallow a battalion without changing its expression. My team watched me closely now. They didn't know why, but they felt the shift. Leaders don't need to announce when something personal enters the equation. It shows up in how they breathe, how long they wait before answering. I told them we were holding for 10 minutes. Not an order. A marker. 10 minutes to see if the system corrected itself. 10 minutes to see if comms returned, if the battalion reappeared, if the silence broke in any direction that didn't require me to break something else. Nothing happened. No voices. No movement. No explanation. At minute 11, I made the decision I'd been circling since the name appeared. I told command we were advancing to re-establish comms with the battalion. They denied it immediately. Too risky. Unknown threat. Maintain overwatch. I acknowledged the denial. Then I cut the channel. Not permanently. Not dramatically. Just long enough. I didn't frame it as defiance. I framed it as responsibility. Someone had to look at the place where a battalion had vanished without noise. Someone had to confirm whether the village was empty or simply quiet. And someone had to find out why my wife's name had crossed a boundary it wasn't supposed to know existed. We descended carefully, choosing lines that kept us visible to each other and invisible to the village. The closer we got, the more the silence felt intentional, like a room held its breath when you open the door. I kept expecting gunfire. Or movement. Or anything that would justify waiting. Instead, the village waited back. And with every step closer, the distance between following orders and abandoning my wife stopped feeling like a moral debate. It started feeling like an excuse. The first thing I noticed inside the village was how intact it was. Not untouched, intact. Doors were open, not forced. Windows unbroken. A chair lay on its side in one room, like someone stood up too quickly and never came back. Cooking fires were cold but recent. Cups sat half filled with water that hadn't collected dust yet. Whatever had happened here hadn't torn through the place. It had passed through it. We moved slow, clearing angles the way you do when you expect resistance and don't trust the absence of it. The kind of movement that keeps weapons up without advertising fear. Every doorway was checked twice. Every shadow earned a pause. Still nothing. No fighters. No civilians. No signs of a firefight loud enough to erase a battalion. Then we started finding the battalion's traces. A dropped glove near a stairwell. A boot print in the dirt that cut off mid-step, like the ground had decided to stop remembering. A vehicle track that entered the square and never left. The evidence was precise, almost curated. Enough to confirm they'd been here. Not enough to explain where they went. I keyed my radio and brought command back up. I reported contact with the objective area. I described what we were seeing. I asked, again, for clarification on the civilian list. They told me to withdraw. They said another element was inbound. They said the situation was being reassessed. I didn't believe them anymore. Inside one of the larger buildings, we found the first real sign of force. A wall scorched at shoulder height. Not random damage. Controlled. Deliberate. Someone had fired into the room to establish dominance, not to kill. Nearby, zip ties lay in a neat coil on a table, unused but ready. Hostage protocol. My chest tightened. This wasn't a smash and grab. It was organized, rehearsed. Whoever ran this had planned for a battalion, and decided not to fight them. That's when I understood the battalion hadn't been overpowered. They'd been handled. We found the comms gear next. Not destroyed. Disassembled. Batteries removed and placed beside the units like someone wanted to prove a point. Silence by design. The last transmission, the status update, suddenly made sense. It wasn't sent because they were still operational. It was sent because someone allowed it. A signal to buy time. To freeze the perimeter. To keep us on the ridge while something else moved. I stepped outside and scanned the valley beyond the village. Narrow paths ran off into the tree line, invisible from above. Routes only locals, or someone who'd studied the ground long enough, would trust. My mind went back to the data burst. The list. The way it bypassed command and landed with us. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. And my wife wasn't collateral. She was leverage. A low crack echoed from the far side of the village. Not a shot, too controlled. A signal. We shifted instinctively, spreading, covering arcs we hadn't needed seconds before. Movement flickered at the edge of sight. Then another. We were being watched now. Measured the same way we'd been measuring the empty streets. The ambush didn't come all at once. It never does when the other side wants options. The first burst hit high, forcing us down. The second cut off our retreat. Smoke followed, thick, disciplined, placed to blind without panic. Whoever was out there knew exactly how long to press and when to pull back. This wasn't about stopping us. It was about slowing me down. Because somewhere beyond the village, hostages were moving. And time had just become the enemy that didn't care about rank, orders, or excuses. The ambush didn't try to finish us. That was the first clue. Fire came in controlled waves, enough to force us into cover, not enough to pin us there. Smoke rolled across the narrow lanes, placed to cut sightlines without choking movement entirely. Whoever planned this understood how to slow a unit without stopping it. They weren't buying victory. They were buying time. I split the team and pushed through the smoke on staggered movement, using sound and shadow to keep orientation when vision failed. We advanced 10 meters, then 20, then broke contact again as the fire thinned and vanished like it had never been there. No bodies. No gear. No mistakes. The village swallowed the attackers the same way it had swallowed the battalion. I checked the clock and felt the pressure sharpen. Hostages don't move fast unless the route is controlled. The paths out of the village led into steep ground where vehicles would struggle and radios would degrade. If they were moving people, including my wife, they were doing it with preparation and cover. We followed the signs they hadn't bothered to erase. Not tracks, patterns. Doors left ajar in a sequence that suggested flow. A rope scuffed against stone where someone had paused to resecure it. A dropped scarf near a turn that didn't make sense unless someone had stumbled. Command finally broke through with a demand to withdraw. They cited risk escalation, unknown force size, and the lack of authorization to pursue into adjacent terrain. I acknowledged the transmission. Then I kept moving. Because authorization doesn't mean much when the cost of waiting is measured in names instead of assets. We took the high route, climbing above the village to re-establish perspective. From elevation, the valley unfolded into a network of cuts and spines, routes designed to disappear people, not hide vehicles. The kind of ground locals choose because it doesn't forgive outsiders. Another burst of fire snapped from ahead, closer this time, more precise. It forced us to ground at a choke point where retreat would be loud and advance would be expensive. Smoke followed again, but thinner, placed to suggest presence rather than conceal movement. A message. I keyed the radio and spoke into the open channel, not knowing who would hear it. "I'm not here for the battalion," I said. "I'm here for the civilians." The response came back on a frequency I hadn't used. Calm. Measured. Anonymous. "Then you're late," the voice said. It wasn't my wife's voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized. But it confirmed everything. They knew why I was moving. They knew which pressure mattered. And they knew that slowing me down was enough to shape the outcome without risking a fight they didn't need. The fire eased again. The path ahead opened just enough to tempt pursuit. Classic corridor work, give the illusion of progress while draining momentum. I made another decision. We stopped. Not because I wanted to. Because chasing the shape they offered would only cost more time. Instead, I split the element and sent eyes wide, probing routes they hadn't shaped yet. If they wanted us delayed, the fastest way through was to refuse the path they controlled. The valley went quiet. Too quiet. And in that silence, I felt the weight of the truth settle fully. The ambush wasn't about the battalion, or even the hostages. It was about control, about deciding how fast I could move toward my wife, and how much of the mountain I'd have to pay for every minute I tried to take back. Stopping changed everything. Not immediately, but enough. The valley didn't react the way it had before. No warning shots. No smoke drifting in to suggest direction. The pressure that had been guiding us forward loosened, like a hand that expected resistance and found none. I sent 2 men wide, uphill and down, probing routes that didn't make sense if your goal was to move hostages quickly. Steep, uneven, inconvenient. The kind of ground planners avoid unless they're forced to account for it. That was the point. If they were counting on us following the obvious path, then refusing it would cost them something. Maybe not time. Maybe not distance. Attention. Minutes passed. Then more. I felt the clock ticking anyway. Even without contact, time was still moving in their favor. Hostages don't need escorts forever, only long enough to disappear into the right place. The first sign we'd disrupted the plan came as sound. Not gunfire. Footsteps. Far off. Uncoordinated. A group moving uphill faster than they should have been. Not disciplined enough to be security, not panicked enough to be fleeing civilians. I pulled the team toward the noise, keeping spacing loose and profiles low. The terrain forced us into a series of switchbacks where every turn threatened exposure. We moved anyway. At the crest, we saw them. Not all of them. Just the back end of the movement, 3 armed men and several civilians pushed hard but not handled roughly. The escorts kept distance, weapons visible but not raised. This wasn't chaos. It was control with limits. I scanned faces fast, knowing what I was looking for and afraid of finding it. She wasn't there. Relief hit first, then fear. If my wife wasn't in this group, then she'd been separated earlier, moved along a different route, held back for leverage, or already transferred to someone else. That meant we were behind. The escort spotted us at the same moment I realized they'd allowed it. They didn't scatter. They didn't fire. One of them raised a hand and spoke sharply to the civilians, redirecting them downslope while the others established positions that discouraged pursuit without committing to a fight. Another delay. I keyed the radio again, requesting any ISR that could reach us. The response came back thin. Limited coverage. Terrain interference. No immediate support. We were alone in this piece of the mountain. I made the call. We engaged. Not aggressively. Precisely. Fire cracked from our position, tight and controlled, forcing the escorts to ground without endangering the civilians. They responded just long enough to keep distance, then broke contact exactly the way the battalion's attackers had earlier, clean, disciplined, leaving no one behind. We reached the civilians seconds later. They were shaken but alive. Local. Terrified. They told us they'd been moved twice already. That others had gone a different way. That names had been called and groups separated. I asked the question I'd been avoiding. They didn't know her name. But they described her. And the description matched. They said she'd been taken uphill first. Not rushed. Guarded closely. Like she mattered more than the rest. I felt the mountain narrow again, not physically, but in possibility. Every decision now had a sharper edge. Every route carried a cost that couldn't be paid twice. We secured the civilians and sent them back with the smaller element, even though it split us further. I couldn't afford to move slower to protect everyone. I had to choose who needed me most. As they disappeared downslope, I turned uphill with the rest of the team, following a path that hadn't been offered, hadn't been shaped, and therefore hadn't been defended yet. Above us, the mountain waited. And somewhere ahead, someone was still deciding how long they could afford to keep my wife moving before I reached her. The climb punished urgency. Loose stone slid under boots, turning speed into noise and noise into risk. The air thinned just enough to remind you that time isn't only measured by clocks. It's measured by breath, by the space between steps, by how often you have to stop and let your body catch up with your intent. We moved anyway. The route hadn't been shaped because it wasn't efficient. It bent away from the obvious lines, climbing into broken shelves where visibility came and went without warning. That told me something important: whoever planned this expected us to choose the fastest way, not the hardest. We didn't. Halfway up, the first sign of resistance appeared, not fire, but absence. The birds were gone. Wind moved through the trees without interruption. The mountain felt cleared, not empty. That distinction matters when someone else has been there recently and doesn't want to be followed. I ordered a halt and listened. Nothing. Then a sound that didn't belong, a single rock shifting uphill, deliberate enough to be human. We fanned out instinctively, weapons up, spacing wide. The rock wasn't a mistake. It was a test. Fire came from above, brief and precise, snapping into stone just ahead of us. Not close enough to wound. Close enough to turn movement into thought. Smoke followed, thin and disciplined, drifting sideways to suggest direction without revealing origin. Delay again. They were good at this. I answered with movement instead of fire, pushing laterally into cover that offered angles they hadn't prepared. The contact dissolved the moment we threatened proximity. Whoever was up there didn't want to trade distance for control. We gained ground. At the next shelf, we found evidence of passage, scuffed bark where ropes had rubbed, a shallow groove cut by repeated boots, the faint smell of fuel that didn't belong this high up. They'd stopped here long enough to reorganize. Long enough to transfer people. I checked the time and felt the math tighten. If my wife had been moved again, it meant she was still considered valuable. Alive. Managed. That thought carried weight, hope with conditions. We followed the signs into a narrow traverse where the mountain dropped away on one side and rose sharply on the other. A place where speed is tempting and mistakes are final. The escorts had chosen it because it limited options. So did we. Halfway through, a voice called out from above. Calm. Unhurried. It spoke in a language meant to reassure the civilians, not threaten us. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the tone. Control without cruelty. That told me everything I needed to know about how far this could go. The people moving my wife didn't need to hurt her to win. They needed me late, tired, and unsure. We pushed through the traverse and crested into a small clearing just as movement broke ahead. Figures peeled away in practiced coordination, leaving behind nothing but distance and the sense that we'd arrived moments too late. No shots followed. They let us see the path continue. That was the message now: you can follow, but you'll pay for every meter with time you don't have. I gathered the team and made the next call knowing exactly what it would cost. We would keep going. We would accept the ground's terms. And we would stop reacting to the delays they offered. Because somewhere ahead, the mountain was running out of places to hide movement. And if they wanted to keep my wife moving, they'd have to choose a place to stop. When they did, I intended to be close enough that delay would no longer be an option. The mountain changed character near dusk. Not in shape, in intent. The paths tightened, then widened into a series of terraces cut into the slope long before any of us were here. Old work. Old stone. The kind of place people choose when they need to pause without being seen from below. Whoever was moving the hostages hadn't just memorized routes, they understood when to use them. We slowed without being told. Fatigue had crept into our legs, but clarity sharpened instead of dulling. Delay had been their tool all day. Here, delay stopped working. The ground offered fewer options to vanish cleanly, and every pause risked exposure. That's when we heard voices. Not close. Not shouting. Normal conversation, carried downhill by cooling air. The kind of sound people make when they believe they have time. I raised a fist and the team froze, breaths held, boots planted where they were. I edged forward alone. From behind a low wall of stacked stone, I saw them. A small security element. 2 men watching the slope we'd come from, weapons slung but ready. Beyond them, civilians seated on the ground, hands bound loosely, guarded without cruelty. This wasn't panic management. It was inventory. And then I saw her. She was seated apart from the others, upright, shoulders squared, trying to look calm for people who needed it. Her hands were tied, but not tightly. She hadn't been handled roughly. That wasn't mercy. It was calculation. She was leverage they wanted intact. I pulled back and signaled the team into positions that gave us angles without announcing intent. We had the advantage now: elevation, surprise, distance measured in seconds instead of minutes. For the first time since the village, the choice wasn't being shaped for us. I keyed the radio to call command. Then I stopped. Because whatever came next wouldn't fit into a request. Support wouldn't arrive in time. ISR wouldn't change the ground. And higher authority would default to caution that my wife couldn't afford. I looked at the men guarding her. They weren't relaxed. They weren't afraid. They were waiting. Not for us, for instructions. That told me the operation wasn't finished yet. She hadn't reached the final handoff. This was a staging point, chosen because it allowed time for decisions to be made elsewhere. Time I was about to take back. I whispered orders, assigning arcs and timing. No heroics. No rush. We'd practiced this 100 times in places that didn't matter nearly as much. The first man went down quietly, controlled and clean. The second turned just in time to see us already moving. He raised his weapon halfway before choosing survival over resistance. The civilians froze. My wife didn't. She looked straight at me, recognition immediate, no disbelief, no hesitation. Just understanding, the same kind I'd seen in her eyes years ago when we agreed that our lives would never be simple again. "Don't stop," I told her. "Not yet." We cut bindings fast and moved them into cover, repositioning before the mountain could answer back. I knew this wouldn't stay quiet for long. The delay had failed, but the cost was about to arrive. Somewhere above us, someone would realize the schedule had collapsed. And when they did, restraint would no longer be useful. The mountain had one more decision left to force. Whether it would let us leave with what we'd taken back, or demand payment in the only currency it had left. The first shot came from above, not aimed to kill. It struck stone hard enough to send fragments skittering across the terrace, a warning disguised as precision. Whoever was coordinating this had just been told the schedule collapsed, and restraint had expired. We moved immediately. I pushed the civilians downslope in controlled bursts, rotating cover so no one stayed exposed long enough to become a solution. My wife stayed close, matching pace without needing to be told. She didn't ask questions. She watched angles, adjusted to terrain, trusted the movement. It was the quiet competence of someone who understands danger without needing to face it often. Fire intensified as we descended. Short, sharp bursts from multiple elevations, testing our rhythm, forcing us to change cadence. They weren't trying to overrun us yet. They were shaping us again, compressing routes, closing exits, forcing decisions with fewer good answers. Smoke bloomed behind us, then ahead. Too perfect. Too timed. It cut sightlines at exactly the points where panic would be most expensive. I felt the mountain narrow, options collapsing into a single thread we'd have to hold without breaking. I made the call to split again. One element peeled left, climbing into cover that looked worse than it was, drawing fire that followed instinct instead of plan. The rest of us continued downslope, faster now, the civilians moving because stopping had become more dangerous than speed. A round snapped past my ear, close enough to leave a memory. Another cracked into dirt near my wife's feet. She stumbled once, recovered, kept moving. No scream. No hesitation. Just momentum. That mattered. We reached a cut in the slope where the ground dropped sharply into a ravine choked with brush. From above, it looked like a dead end. From inside it, it was an escape, narrow, ugly, and invisible to anyone who hadn't committed to following. We vanished into it. The fire above intensified for seconds after we disappeared, then faltered. The enemy searched for angles that no longer existed. Delay returned, not for us, but for them. We pushed through the ravine hard, branches tearing at gear, footing uneven, sound swallowed by vegetation. It wasn't fast, but it was hidden. The kind of movement that trades comfort for survival. Halfway through, the radio crackled to life. Command, finally present, finally urgent. Questions piled on top of each other, where we were, what we'd found, why we were off task, why we'd broken contact. I answered only one. "We have civilians," I said. "We're moving." There was a pause. A recalculation. Then a change in tone that told me they were adjusting the story they'd eventually write. Extraction coordinates followed. Late. Compromised. Still usable if we reached them before the mountain corrected again. We emerged from the ravine just as dusk tipped into night. The terrain opened enough to move faster, but not enough to relax. Fire followed intermittently now, less coordinated, more frustrated. They'd lost the clean control they'd held all day. I looked at my wife once as we moved. She met my eyes and nodded. Not gratitude. Not relief. Acknowledgement. We weren't safe yet. And both of us knew the next price would be higher, because once you're seen taking something back, the system doesn't ask whether you deserved it. It asks how much you're willing to pay to keep it. Night erased the mountain's edges. Distances collapsed. Sounds lost direction. The terrain that had punished urgency now rewarded patience, swallowing movement in shadow and uneven ground. We moved without lights, without voices, guided by touch and memory more than sight. The extraction point was still ahead, but the mountain had one more lesson to offer before it let us go. The fire stopped. Not because they'd lost us, because they'd decided something else. Silence returned with intent. The kind that forces you to question whether you're still being hunted, or if you've been written off as no longer worth the effort. I didn't trust it. Silence had been their best weapon all day. We slowed further. Every step felt like a negotiation. Brush snagged gear. Rocks shifted under weight that wanted to move faster than caution allowed. The civilians followed the rhythm we set, breathing controlled, fear kept functional. My wife stayed near the center of the movement, protected without being isolated. Then the radio went dead again. Not interference. Not terrain. A clean cut. I felt the system lose us in real time. Somewhere behind screens and maps, our icons froze. Timers stopped advancing. The story paused without resolution. And that was the moment we were safest. Because the mountain doesn't answer to tracking software. And whatever group had engineered the ambush had built their plan around visibility, controlling what could be seen, what could be followed, what could be slowed. We were now none of those things. A flare rose far to the west, painting the clouds briefly. Not for us. A search pattern adjusting to an absence it didn't understand. The enemy was still operating, but their net had a hole they hadn't planned for. We reached the extraction zone late. Too late for comfort. Too early for abandonment. The aircraft came in low and quiet, rotors cutting through air that still smelled faintly of smoke. No celebration. No relief. Just urgency wrapped in procedure. As we loaded, I looked back once. The mountain gave nothing away. No movement. No silhouettes. No sign of pursuit or surrender. Just darkness holding whatever truths it had decided not to return. Command met us on the other end with questions shaped like concern. What happened? Who was responsible? Why the battalion's status conflicted with our report? Why civilians appeared in a place they hadn't acknowledged? I answered what I could. I didn't answer what I couldn't prove. The battalion was officially declared extracted. The hostages were marked accounted for. The village was listed as cleared by unknown elements. My wife's name disappeared from the system the same way it had entered, without explanation. The report closed itself. Later, alone, I replayed the last transmission again in my head. The comm status update sent after the battalion was already gone. The one that had frozen us in place long enough for the mountain to move people without interference. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been a message. And now, standing on the other side of it, I understood the final truth this operation left behind. Some missions don't fail because of resistance. They succeed because they vanish. Taking the evidence with them. Weeks later, the operation existed only as a sequence of clean lines. Dates aligned. Units accounted for. Objectives marked complete. The battalion that never checked in was listed as extracted through channels that didn't require elaboration. No footage attached. No after-action interviews scheduled. The system had decided how much of the story it was willing to remember. I was called in once. Not for debrief. For alignment. They asked careful questions framed as confirmations. Did the civilians receive medical screening? Did we encounter resistance after the village? Did we observe any hostile force capable of detaining a battalion? I answered accurately. Accuracy doesn't always include meaning. They didn't ask about the last transmission. They didn't ask how a status update could be sent from a unit that no one could locate. They didn't ask why a hostage list appeared outside the system and then erased itself without leaving a trace. And I didn't volunteer explanations they couldn't store. My wife was released from questioning the same day. No charges. No paperwork. No acknowledgement beyond a line that said she had been present during a security incident. She wasn't offered apologies. She wasn't asked for details. She was returned. At home, silence replaced adrenaline. That's the part no one prepares you for. The way normal sounds feel too loud after mountains. The way doors closing sound like decisions being finalized without you. We didn't talk about the village right away. We talked about ordinary things instead. Groceries. Repairs. Time that had passed without waiting for permission. Only later, when the quiet had settled enough to hold weight, did she ask the one question that mattered. Did they ever explain it? I shook my head. She nodded, like she'd expected that answer all along. Because she'd seen their restraint up close. The way her captors avoided names. The way instructions were relayed without faces attached. The way no one raised a voice unless it was necessary. They hadn't been criminals. They'd been operators working inside a gap the system preferred not to map. That realization didn't bring comfort. It brought clarity. The battalion hadn't been lost. It had been moved. Where, by whom, and under what authority were questions that would never be asked loudly enough to demand answers. The mountain had done its part. The paperwork had done the rest. Sometimes I catch myself replaying the last moments before extraction, the way the fire tapered off, the way pursuit dissolved instead of breaking, the way no one tried to stop us once we passed a certain point. As if there were boundaries even violence respected. Kilometers later, jurisdictions shifted. Interests overlapped. Accountability thinned. And somewhere in that space, the battalion became something else. Not missing. Not dead. Just unlocatable. That's the final cost of operations like this. Not casualties you can count. But truths you can't retrieve once they've been filed away without witnesses. The mountain kept its silence. The system kept its order. And the only proof the battalion ever existed in that village lives with the people who walked out of it, carrying names that vanished from records, and memories that will never be requested again. That's why this story doesn't end with confirmation. Because some missions don't leave conclusions. They leave absences. And absences are easier to manage. As long as no one insists on filling them in. Not every outcome comes from action. Some come from waiting too long. If you want more stories like this, like the video and subscribe. And if help arrived 1 minute later, what would still be standing?